This is COMD Hearing Science. This is the first of 3 parts lecture on the temporal bone, which is the home of the auditory system, of the peripheral auditory system. This lecture in 3 parts covers also or addresses study questions 35 through 61. So here we go. We start with the skull. And as we look at the skull, we're going to be focusing on the part of the skull that is known as the cranial skeleton, the part of the skeleton that surrounds the brain. In COMD 462, you'll be spending more time on the facial skeleton. We won't be doing that here in this class. There's 14 bones in the facial skeleton, 8 bones in total. In the cranial skeleton, for a total of 22 bones of the skull altogether. So our focus, though, here is on the bones of the cranial skeleton, the part of the skull that surrounds the brain, more or less. This is out of the cycle book, and again detailing over here what would be the facial skeleton, and over here what would be the cranial skeleton, and that's what we're really most interested in. Now, one of the tasks facing you, based on the study questions, is for you to be able to recite, to memorize the bones of the cranial skeleton. I assume you'll do the same thing for the facial skeleton in COMD 462, and maybe you already have. But our task right here is to work on these. So what we have to kind of now know is that there are, and we'll see them on the next slide, we'll see most of them, is that there's one each of the following bones: frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid. I'm underlining the first letter in this because we're going to create a mnemonic here to try to remember these. There are there are 2 pairs of other bones. There is a pair of parietal bones and a pair of temporal bones. The pair is because there's one on the right side and then there's one on the left side. So if we were to again, go back to the slide before this, slide number 3. We said that there was 8 bones in total. And so what do we have? We've got the 4 singleton bones plus 2 parietals plus 2 temporal bones. Now, there's a variety of different mnemonics for you to try to remember this. I just put this pest off. So you got the P for parietal, ethmoid, sphenoid, temporal. And I put the subtext of the 2 so you could see that it was that. There's a variety of others. You could say step off my skull. You could say old people from Texas eat spiders, or make up your own as far as the mnemonics and stuff go. If we look at some of these some of the different skull bones here, the one that we're primarily interested in for our purposes is the temporal bone. We can't really see all of the important parts of the temporal bone on this. This is a shot we used before. This is this left lateral view, and so there are some structures that we can only see in the midline, but again, as you can kind of see here, this would be the temporal bone, at least on the left lateral view, all of this stuff in through here, and at least on the left lateral part. And what we're going to do here in a second is we're going to kind of divide this up into some portions and kind of look at the different sections of these. Out of the cycle book is again the skull. This part here would be anterior. This part here would be posterior. It's kind of on an angle. It's not. If this was straight up, it'd be like that. So it's kind of on an angle. And this was that coronal suture, but now that's been pulled apart. And so we can't, we're seeing the frontal bone separated out from the parietal bone on the left side. So the same thing is happening here. There is a suture line here, and the temporal bone has been pulled away. And so again, as we're looking at the temporal bone, it's this big chunk of bone over here that's been pulled out of the skull. Temporal bone has kind of a interesting, I think, sort of meaning. We could think of some other words in English that you might think sort of sound like it. You might think of maybe the word temporary. It has to do with this concept here, which sort of equals time. And that would be reasonable, but that's not the root here that we're looking at. Like many words, there might be a similar root, but they're actually similar looking root, but they're different. In this case, this is from the word templus, or the word that we get in English from this would be temple. And in fact, the side of the head like that is called the temple, still is often referred to it as the temple. But temple in its original terminology, because this was intended to be or thought to be a holy place. This was thought to be where your holiness was, at least to the Romans. This is Latin, so to the ancient Romans, the space between these two bones on the sides of your head was where your holiness resided. So that was the temple. So it was a place that was sacred, believe it or not. So the temporal bone, we've got actually two of them. We got one on the right side, one on the left side. They're mirror images of each other. And when we look at either one of them, we can see that the temporal bone forms part of the lateral wall of the skull. We see that on the lateral view, like we've seen those left lateral views. And coming off of it on a sort of a 90-degree angle is part of the base or the floor of the skull. So it's really, if you want to look at it from the sort of in a frontal section, here would be the lateral wall, and then here's the part that would be then the base. If we were to look at a sort of a frontal section facing the person, and this would be like on their left side, this would be the left lateral view, this would be the left floor of the skull base. And looking at pictures here, again, outlined, here's the temporal bone in the context of all of the other bones. This is a lateral view of the temporal bone as we look at it. And again, you don't see all the parts of it that are sort of important to us in this particular view. And in a slide or two, I'll kind of show you all of these. On slide 12, all of the different parts are indicated for you, and you can kind of see them just quickly. Here's your squamous portion. This portion is called the tympanic. This is the mastoid here, and then there's a other more important piece that we don't see here that's alluded to there, which is the petrous portion, which you can see only when you're looking into the skull base. So, important facts about the temporal bone. Fact number one, you have two of them. You have a right and you have a left. Fact number two, temporal bones contain the structures of the peripheral auditory system. Point number three, there's an entry into and an exit out of the temporal bone on each side. So there's a hole leading into it and there's a hole leading out of it. Portions of the temporal bone, particularly the portion that we'll see in a second called the mastoid portion, contains many air chambers. One of the questions that's on one of the study questions, study question SQ42, asks what's special about the mastoid, and the simple answer would be what's special about the mastoid is it contains many air chambers. Some of them are relatively large. When we think of bone, you might think of bone as being solid and hard and everything like that, and that's correct most of the time. But this particular section of the temporal bone, the mastoid section, is actually filled with cavities of air. Finally on this slide, and again consistent with study question 41, which asks what's special about the petrous portion, petrous, P-T-R-O-U-S, the temporal bone, specifically the petrous portion of the temporal bone, is the hardest, densest bone in the body. This word petrous, like my name Peter, means something that's very, very hard, that's very dense. Hard and dense. So this section of the temporal bone known as the petrous portion, one thing that's special about it is it happens to be the hardest, densest bone in the body. There are other things that are special about the petrous portion. We'll talk about those too. So generally said then, the four basic sections of the temporal bone that are most important to us, the squamous, the mastoid, the tympanic, and the petrous. And again, on the left lateral view, you cannot see, that's an awful line. Let me take that off. So let's try it again, squamous, mastoid, tympanic, and petrous. And you can't see all of these on the same view. It's very difficult to see all of those. So you typically have to take two different perspectives to see all four parts. There is also an anterior projection that we've seen that provides the connection between the cranial skeleton and the facial skeleton, and that's all called the zygomatic process or the zygomatic arch. That's really more of a COMD 462 concept, so we'll just kind of leave it right there. This is not from the cycle book, but a picture that is a lateral surface, but now we're on the other side of the skull, showing us again the temporal bone here shown in purple. So again, if I was to outline this here, this portion there is the squamous portion. And it just says here temporal squama, but that's what we can call the squamous. Squamous, again, one of the points that I'll make to you about anatomists and anatomy terminology is they're either A, very egocentric because they name stuff after themselves, or like, Bob's cell or something like that, or they're very concrete and they just name it after something that sort of is visually iconic. Now, you might not appreciate it, but squamous has to do with the original derivation of the word has to do with sort of the scale of a fish. And if you ever looked up close at the scale of a fish, it looks sort of just like that, sort of this sort of oblong, uniformly oblong, rectangular looking kind of shape. And so different cells in the body that, and different locations and different parts of the body that have that kind of scale-like look often have the adjective of a squamous type of thing. So there's a squamous cell in the skin. Here's this squamous portion of the temporal bone. The portion that is then inferior and slightly posterior to that, and you can't really tell on this, is the mastoid portion. The mastoid portion has this big prominence that kind of sticks out here. And you can actually feel, you can feel the squamous portion too. If you were to put your fingers up on the side of your head, right above the fleshy part of the ear that's hanging on the side of your head, that flat part right there above and behind your ear, that's the squamous portion. If you bring your hands and fingers down, just kind of going along the margin of your outer ear, you'll eventually come up to a point that's kind of rounded, and that would then be this section right here that I drew kind of big. So this kind of prominence here that you will feel there is this kind of big rounded bump right there. And again, that big rounded bump is the mastoid portion. And the rest of this is also part of the mastoid cell. But when we think of the mastoid portion, we're thinking of this big kind of rounded protuberance there of bone that's kind of right under your ear there. Additionally, in this shot, we can see here a ring of bone that has a hole in it, and that's called the tympanic portion. That's not specifically labeled on this slide, but that's where that is. And the fourth part, we can't really see on this. We cannot see the petrous portion. But we can see here the zygomatic arch, and you see it kind of goes up to here, and then it connects up to the maxillary process and kind of connects up over here to connect up there. It connects up to the zygomatic arch, zygomatic bone here. So we have the connection then to the facial skeleton from there. In this particular view, this is the squamous suture, and that again we saw it on an earlier slide where that was pulled apart. You go back to slide 7, and you'll see that kind of pulled apart. On this particular view, it's sort of like right through there, so that would be all the squamous portion. Down through here is then the mastoid portion, and right in there is the tympanic. And from an earlier iteration, you see them identified with those colors of red, yellow, and green. Now, in order to see the petrous portion, we actually have to look into the skull. And so again, as I've noted here, this is left, this is right, this is anterior, this is posterior, so that we have a temporal bone on each side. This particular section of bone, again, this would have been a horizontal section at some point through the skull, where there is an upper and a lower. And so this portion I just outlined here would probably have been part of the squamous portion. And then we're looking into the skull base, looking into the skull, the depth of the skull with the brain removed. The colors here may be a little confusing, but remember in this particular image, we're looking at purple denoting the mastoid, I'm sorry, the purple denoting the temporal bone. Okay, so we got one on the left side, we got one on the right side, but the purple. This is the floor of the skull base, so all of right through here is what we're going to identify as the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Now, what you can't appreciate is that it's kind of like a mountain like that. And that has this kind of rise through the, in the skull base. You can kind of see it here. There are holes in the petrous portion, and there'll be a nerve coming out of this. In fact, this hole here we'll call in a few minutes the internal auditory canal. Right inside here is where the hearing organ is inside, right in there. The part of the ear we call the middle ear is sort of right under this particular bone and through there, and we can't see it here, but there'd be a hole in your ear somewhere over there. So the basic parts of the peripheral auditory system are right in sequence right through there. And again, as we said, there's got to be a hole into it, not depicted on this slide. There's got to be a hole out of it, which is depicted right there. When you're looking into the skull base, this big hole right there is where the brainstem would be, and the different parts of the brain would be in these different sort of basins, if you will, in the floor of the skull. Okay, so concluding part 1 of our slide set, you should be able to identify the bones of the cranial skeleton if you were pissed off, or if you know old people from Texas who eat spiders, that might help you. And the major sections of the temporal bone, which we identified as the squamous, the mastoid, the tympanic, and as well the petrous. Again, one of the other questions was, well, what's special about the mastoid? It contains air. It has a lot of air cavities in it, which is kind of unusual. What's special about the petrous? It's the hardest bone in the body, bar none. And you could also say what's special about it is it contains the auditory system. So that's where the peripheral, at least the peripheral auditory system is. Peripheral auditory. So we got a couple points of distinction relative to the petrous portion of the temporal bone. We will move on now to part 2.